Welcome to the full guide to Dr. Ratio, where I'll show you how to L+ratio your enemies, just like how Genshin impacted to its players. As a Hunt Imaginary character, Dr. Ratio specializes in dealing single target damage. His kit revolves around doing follow-up attacks which are mostly triggered by using a skill. This follow-up attack has a 40% chance to trigger every time Dr. Ratio uses his skill. Sounds like a tad bit inconsistent, but this base chance can be increased by 20% for each debuff an enemy has. So, on hitting an enemy with 3 debuffs, Dr. Ratio will have a 100% chance to trigger his follow-up attack. These follow-up attacks are his main source of damage and hit harder than your teacher did back in the day when you didn't behave in class. His follow-up attacks still trigger even if his target enemy is killed by his skill. Next up, we have his ultimate. With the power of maths and physics on his side, he takes a huge pillar and smacks it on his enemies, dealing damage to a single target and applying the debuff Wise Man's Folly on them. Although the damage ratios of this ultimate are rather lacking, the main point is the application of the debuff. As when enemies with this debuff get hit, it automatically triggers Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack for up to 2 times. For his technique, Dr. Ratio makes a JoJo reference and smacks a Pillarman statue of himself right in front of him. This statue taunts nearby enemies for 10 seconds and on entering battle, gives a 15% speed debuff to them for the first 2 turns. His normal attack is the same as every other character in the game, so let's move on to his traces. Dr. Ratio's traces are all debuff centric. 2 of his traces boost his damage by increasing crit rate, crit damage, and damage percent depending on the amount of debuffs on enemies. And the third trace allows him to debuff his enemy's effect resistance by 10% for 2 turns when he attacks them. So TLDR, his kit is basically more debuffs on enemies equals more buffs on him plus more follow-ups equals more damage. Moving on, it's time to talk about his Litecoin options. First off, we have Dr. Ratio in his full glory, increasing both crit rate and crit damage while also boosting damage dealt to enemies and making his follow-up attacks ignore defense. This is truly his best in slot. Worrisome Blissful is the second best option after Dr. Ratio's signature Litecoin. It increases crit rate, follow-up attack damage, and provides him with another debuff. Next up is Cruising in the Stellar Seas, the Herta Shop Litecoin that can be maxed out by anyone. This Litecoin increases both crit rate and attack percentage and is the best free-to-play option for Dr. Ratio. Sleep Like the Dead works as a fairly good stat stick and is a good option if you have it. For 4-star options, we have only Silence Remains, which although conditional gives both crit rate and attack, and Swordplay, which gives a lot of damage percent but is harder to stack with Dr. Ratio due to his lack of multi-hit attacks. Now let's talk about building Dr. Ratio. For traces, due to his follow-up attack being the most important part of his kit, you want to level up his talent first, and then his skill, and then ultimate. His normal attack is irrelevant. Now moving on to Relics, his best 4-piece set is the Wastelander set, as it gives him an imaginary damage bonus, extra crit rate, and crit damage. If you can't get 4-piece Wastelanders, then you can make a 2-piece combination of any of the Folic relics on screen. For planner ornaments, these are the usable sets on him, although I would recommend the upper 2 sets more. And for main stats, I would recommend crit damage body, speed boots, imaginary damage bonus sphere, and attack percent rope. You're using crit damage body as Dr. Ratio gets a lot of crit rate from both his traces and his Litecoin options. As for speed boots, it's pretty obvious. Speed is one of the best stats in Honkai Star Rail, and more speed equals more damage. Now let's look at what teams Dr. Ratio is gonna be good in. First off, let's talk about what type of characters a Dr. Ratio team is made of. Looking at Dr. Ratio's kit, he's heavily dependent on debuffs. Therefore, you have to run him with the debuffer on the team. For the next slot, a Harmony character buffing up Dr. Ratio even more, or a sub-DPS character further contributing to more team damage is recommended. And as for the last slot, you gotta keep your team alive, so that's reserved for the sustain character. Now let's talk about debuffers. In the list of debuffers, Silverwolf is the best character because she herself can top off and max out all the debuff requirements that Dr. Ratio needs. For 4-star options, Pella and Guinaifen are very solid options who are able to provide decent enough debuffs for Dr. Ratio to get her stacks. Wealth is another option that you can run with Dr. Ratio, and he's a very interesting one as he can act both as a sub DPS and a debuffer. Speaking of sub DPS characters, Topaz is a very solid character in this niche. She can even apply debuffs on enemies that increase his follow-up damage. Another sub DPS option is Himeko, who can also apply burn debuffs on enemies and gives Dr. Ratio teams a much needed AoE coverage. Now let's talk about buffers. First off, we have Ruan Mei, who's the best buffer for Dr. Ratio as she's skill point friendly and increases speed, damage percent, and even break efficiency. Next up, we have Bronia, who's a very good option as well, but her problem is that she's very skill point hungry, so you will need your other characters to be very skill point positive for you to functionally run the team. For 4-star options, we have Tingyun and Yukong. Tingyun can buff attack and can also give energy. Although the energy giving is not as important, it still is a very useful thing to have. For Yukong, she increases imaginary damage, crit rate, crit damage, and attack, but she's a bit clunky to play, but depending on how well speed tuned your team is, she can be very useful. And finally, we have the sustain characters. The best character for this slot is Huahua. She's a very good sustain character who even buffs attack and gives party-wide energy regen. She can even apply debuffs for the first 2 turns of a battle by using her technique. As for other options, Luocha is still a very high S positive healer, and Natasha and Lynx are both very good 4-star options for this slot. And finally, a rather weird option for this slot is Wealth, who can have a break effect and effect hit rate build, who can be played as a sustain by using his ability to slow down enemies and impair them to the fullest, making sure that they never get a turn to hit you. This is not a very common or recommended strat, but I find it very interesting, so I put it here anyways. Alright, that's it for the guide. Hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time.